This will once again sound a great deal like the grade 9 section. In fact, in many textbooks, they will just outright copy-paste this. But in case we forgot, which most of us probably did, given that, well, I mean, it really isn't much, we should go over again why scientific literacy is important for living and working in Canada and in the world in general. Or elsewhere. In general. Now, what is scientific literacy? Well, it basically means that when you see a science report or a piece of news, you know more or less what you're looking at. You aren't completely like, huh? So, the Science Teachers Association of Ontario defines a scientifically literate person as one who can read and understand common media reports about science and technology, critically evaluate the information presented, blah, blah, blah. This essentially means that you read. You have some clue what you have read. I do realize how unflattering this very much summarized version sounds compared to this definition above. But essentially, that's what it boils down to. I mean, come on. Oh, I read a report, and I can evaluate the information presented and discuss it with other people in an intelligent fashion. That's basically, I know what I have just read, or what has just had the good misfortune to pass before my eyes. I mean, there isn't really much else to it. So, I mean, clearly, we all know that in science, we will need to know about science. This makes sense, right? If we want to work in science, we will need scientific literacy. We will need to be able to read scientific journal reports. Or just news in general, for that matter. Even if we don't particularly need to read that many papers. And, well, journal papers are often full of, say, abbreviations or full of technical terms and so on. But the general point they make will always, for the most part, be clear enough. Now, we know that in careers in science, we have, say, doctors, geologists, and so on. Obviously, all these people will work in various locations. Now, scientific literacy, in the broad sense, as in you aren't just good at your particular field, but you need to know about news in general, well, that's important because you might work not only in a lab, in an office, or wilderness, or you might even work in, say, space. Now, you might be thinking, what are geologists doing in space? Well, they could be observing, say, the interaction of water within bodies of rock, or interactions of ice crystal forms, because ice can undergo many different forms of solid. You may want to look this up. So they may want to observe the behavior of ice in microgravity, or almost no gravity, or at least no gravity that they can feel. Because, well, wait a second. How does the International Space Station stay in orbit instead of just flying off? Well, gravity keeps it falling forever. I do realize that I think there's a game called that name, but it's been a long time, so whatever. Now, careers in science will include many different environments. You will need to read various papers and news and so on to accurately judge the dangers or safety measures needed for a particular environment. For example, if you're in the jungle, stepping on a caterpillar can kill you, which is bad. People have died by stepping on caterpillars in jungles. Which, well, okay, that frog over there, that's really colorful, stay away from it. It's because that is a warning color. So being able to judge danger is very, very important. And that requires, well, scientific literacy. Even if you aren't working in a particular field, such as, oh, I am not a biologist. I am here in the jungle to do a geologic survey. Well, you still got to look out. All right. So in life in general, actually, you need to be scientifically literate. In the sense of you can judge which products are a better investment, which are better for you, which are better for the environment, which one's a better long-term investment, so on. Now, medications are a really common thing in everyday life. In modern, well, on average, doctors these days overprescribe considerably in terms of antibiotics. If you have the flu or a cold, you do not need antibiotics of any type. Why? Because the flu, or the common cold for that matter, are viral diseases. Antibiotics do exactly what against viruses? Nothing. Antibiotics disrupt cellular function. Viruses are not cells. In fact, viruses are not even considered life because they cannot replicate, they cannot reproduce on their own or with minimal assistance. They have to hijack the cellular machinery of another cell. Well, if you take too many different antibiotics, you could damage, say, your own, well, gut microbe balance. Technically, we call it a gut microbiome, but the point is that the microbe balance in your gut can be disrupted, and that would be bad. You could end up with, say, diarrhea or constipation, which are quite uncomfortable and especially annoying because these drugs, these antibiotics, have done nothing for your flu or cold. Although we do point out that's technically a strep throat, for example, that's bacterial, so that can be treated by antibiotics. We also point out that overuse of antibiotics, particularly in the agricultural industry, has bred a whole generation of what we call superbugs. We call them this because they are resistant to many, many different types of commonly used antibiotics. So common use of antibiotics in agriculture to reduce the amount of animal diseases in crowded, filthy conditions, which are typical of factory farming meat. Well, this is not good for the long-term viability of antibiotics. Soon we will be in the post-antibiotic age because humans are just too dumb to look forward enough to eat less meat, use less antibiotics on farms, and keep the antibiotics available to save people's lives for longer. You can probably tell, given the many disasters in human history that are caused by agricultural failures, that humans are not exactly the most far-sighted of species. So these risks and so on are things that you need to be concerned about for life, your life or your children's lives for that matter, and citizenship in general. And they require scientific literacy. They require you to understand that, say, oh, I'm eating meat too much. I should eat less meat. Therefore, there will be less demand for factory farms, there will be less overuse of antibiotics, there will be less selective pressures on microbes to evolve resistance. Technically, they don't evolve resistance per se. It's because, say, oh, some of the microbes are already resistant, but normally they're crowded out by the non-resistant ones. What happens when we kill all the non-resistant ones, the susceptible ones? Well, obviously, the resistant microbes will stay alive, they will reproduce, and they will take over the population. So that's what we mean when we say microbes evolve resistance. Anybody who doesn't believe in evolution most likely has not succeeded in this part. Because the fact that reproduction, well, it mostly copies the parent or parents, but it has some mistakes. So these mistakes give variation. And the variations that do best survive and reproduce. So what happens? Well, the population changes over time. This is not a complicated concept. And in fact, it does not require a very long time to do either. So anybody who does not believe in evolution most likely does not have this, unfortunately. The sad fact of life is that, well, there will be more offspring produced in nature than can survive. Therefore, the best adapted to particular conditions will typically, on average, do better. I mean, sure, okay, sometimes a tree falls on an animal, but, well, the point remains that evolution happens, and it's still happening, and will always happen so long as life exists. Now, of course, evolution is not always biological. It can also be cultural. Now, what is an example of cultural evolution? Okay, humans learn to control fire. That is actually cultural evolution, as well as biological, i.e. we're not scared of it as much as, say, other animals are. You will notice that most wild animals are very, very frightened of fire. Well, dogs aren't, but that's mostly because we've domesticated them long enough that they... well, okay, obviously dogs are still somewhat scared of fire in the sense that they will, for the most part, not try to stick any part of their body in it. But the point is that they've been domesticated long enough that they're used to it, more or less. Now, controlling fire, that's cultural evolution. And then we had, say, the wheel. And then we had, well, metalworking, eventually. And so on, steam engines and such. These are all cultural evolution, even though technically calling it evolution is a little bit iffy of a term, depending on interpretation. Now, what else in cultural evolution is scientific literacy important for? Well, clearly investing in all sorts of assets, be it stocks. For example, in 2008, General Motors dropped a great deal in terms of its stock prices. For smart investors, that would have been a great chance to buy General Motors stocks. Why? Because General Motors produces the United States Abrams, their main battle tank. It is not possible for General Motors to be allowed to go bankrupt. Hence, well, scientific literacy would have had people judge based on their knowledge that, oh, well, these guys produce the United States MBTs, and, well, their stocks are really low right now. Well, wait a second. They can't possibly be allowed to go bankrupt, so they will eventually rise again. Well, that's a matter of scientific literacy, in a sense. And, of course, there's also vehicles and household appliances. For example, oh, this fridge is more expensive, but wait a second, it uses a lot less power. Therefore, it is a better buy over the 10 years I expect to use it for, than this fridge that is cheaper but uses more power. And then there's also other responsibilities. For example, we are citizens, or we hope to become citizens eventually. And therefore we have some responsibilities to the environment. We have some responsibilities to humanity in general, to future generations. And therefore, we should protect the environment so that future generations can continue to enjoy what we have, instead of robbing it from them. There is a saying, I believe it is Native American, that is very good. This saying is that we did not inherit the land from our ancestors. We borrowed it from our children. And indeed, that is exactly what we have done. And therefore, we should take good care of our environment, which unfortunately humans are currently not very good at. Now, in summary, scientific literacy helps people properly evaluate various information. Now, this information may be what you usually consider science, or it might be, say, Well, actually, did you know that economics is also a science? I mean, you might think, hey, wait, whoa. We're used to dealing with biology, chemistry, physics. These are the sciences we're used to dealing with. But economics, geology, these things, they're all sciences. So they all fall under the umbrella of scientific literacy, which, as is the case for basically any concept that is so inclusive, is generally useful in everyday life for navigating the world and making better decisions while doing so. Now, a general understanding of science is necessary to be an informed citizen, and to be prosperous. So we add this little bit. Now, specific scientific knowledge and skills are needed for a wide range of careers. Basically, any career that deals with just about anything needs some level of scientific knowledge or skills. For example, even marketing, like advertisements. Yeah, that relies on a lot of psychology. So that is science. Now, we do point out that Canadians, like every other country, well, pretty much, have made valuable contributions to the development of science and technology around the world. For example, let's think about something that Canadians have made. Probably the number one health problem of our current era is diabetes. So insulin. And then there is the number one research tool for biologists, which is electron microscope. And then there's the not so minor fact that Alexander Graham Bell conducted his first telephone call in Canada. So, of course, the United States tends to get a little irritated whenever Canada tries to claim his work, because Bell later moved to the United States and lived there for much of his time. However, he did have a summer home, so to speak, in Nova Scotia. He ended up living there for quite a number of months longer than summer every year, eventually. So, whatever, let's just put telephone. There are many other inventions, but you should feel free to research them yourself. This is actually it for this section. Now, this probably did sound really familiar from grade 9. So, well, let's see if the next section is as familiar. You will find that it is not.